On May 23rd, 1934, at exactly 9:15 a.m., the silence on Louisiana Highway 154 didn't break. It shattered. You've seen the photos of the perforated Ford V8, steam rising from its radiator like a dying breath, but the history books leave out the most important detail. Standing in the tree line, away from the smoke and the smell of hot copper, was Ivan Methvin. He wasn't crying because the two most famous outlaws in America were dead. He was crying because he knew the exact price of the ammunition. A few yards away, coiled in the dirt like a sleeping snake, lay a rusted logging chain, the same heavy iron link that had been used to drag the broken truck into position. That chain wasn't just farm equipment. It was the receipt for a deal made in hell. You think Frank Hamer stopped them with detective work? You're wrong. By late 1933, the American South was paralyzed by a single phantom engine, the Ford V8. It wasn't just a car, it was a fortress that moved at 90 miles per hour. Clyde Barrow didn't just drive. He operated on a frequency the police couldn't tune into. For 2 years, he had embarrassed the finest law enforcement agencies in 5 states, slipping through roadblocks with a smile that suggested he knew something they didn't. In the public eye, he was bulletproof, a Robin Hood of the Dust Bowl who could outrun the wind. But inside that car, the reality was a nightmare of blood, bandages, and exhaust fumes. Clyde wasn't the invincible gangster the papers sold to the depression-struck public. By the spring of 1934, he was a tired, limping man with a half-healed leg and a woman beside him who could barely walk from burns sustained in a previous wreck. They were essentially driving a coffin, fueled by aspirin and adrenaline. The secret flaw in Clyde's armor wasn't his driving or his gunplay. It was his desperate need for rest. He had the money, he had the guns, but he didn't have a place to close his eyes. He needed a safe house more than he needed breath, and that desperation blinded him to the oldest rule in the book. Never trust a man who has something to lose. You see, legends don't die because they make mistakes. They die because they start believing the headlines. Clyde thought he was being hunted by lawmen. He didn't realize he was being hunted by exhaustion. And that exhaustion led him to make the one decision that would seal the cockpit of that Ford V8 forever. That decision had a name: Henry Methvin. He wasn't a mastermind. He wasn't a sharpshooter. He was a kid they'd picked up during a jailbreak in Huntsville, a piece of drifting wreckage Clyde scooped up because he needed an extra gun. Sitting in the back seat of the V8, clutching a Browning automatic rifle he barely knew how to maintain, Henry was a bundle of nerves and bad decisions. But he possessed the one currency Clyde Barrow couldn't steal: a family in Louisiana. The connection was simple geography. The Methvin farm near Gibbsland, Louisiana, was isolated, tucked back into the pines where the law rarely ventured without an invitation. To Clyde, Henry was the ticket to a mattress and a hot meal. To Henry, Clyde was a terrifying boss who held his life in his hands. There was a peculiar silence in the car whenever they crossed into Louisiana, a tension that vibrated through the upholstery. Clyde trusted Henry because Henry seemed simple, pliable, the kind of guy who followed orders. It was a fatal miscalculation. Intelligence isn't the only thing that makes a man dangerous. Fear does a perfectly good job on its own. Henry wasn't loyal to the Barrow gang. He was terrified of the electric chair. And every mile closer to his father's farm wasn't a journey to safety. It was a delivery route. Clyde thought he was bringing a friend home. In reality, he was driving a sacrificial lamb to the altar. The weak link isn't the one that breaks, it's the one that lets the enemy in. Enter Ivan Methvin. If you look at the mugshots of the era, the gangsters look sharp, styled. Ivan looked like the land itself, weathered, cracked, and immovable. He was a planter, a man who measured his life in harvest cycles and hard labor, not bank jobs. When he saw his son slide out of that bullet-riddled car, smelling of stale sweat and gunpowder, Ivan didn't see a criminal legend. He saw a dead man walking. Late one night in early May, watching the trio sleep in the woods on the edge of his property, Ivan did the math. It wasn't complex. If Henry stayed with Clyde, Henry would burn in the chair in Texas. The law was closing in, tight as a noose. There was no if anymore, only when. The only variable Ivan could control was who took the fall. A father's love is a strange, fierce thing. It can drive a man to protect his child, or it can drive him to commit unspeakable treason against a guest. Standing there in the dark, Ivan realized that loyalty to a son outweighs loyalty to a stranger, even if that stranger is the most feared man in America. The decision wasn't made in a burst of anger. It was made with the cold precision of a man culling a sick animal from the herd. He knew what he had to do. The rusted logging chain lying near the barn door caught the moonlight, heavy and silent. It was used to haul timber, but soon it would haul something much heavier. He turned back to the house, his mind already composing the offer. Frank Hamer didn't chase criminals, he hunted them. The legendary Texas Ranger, brought out of retirement specifically to end the Barrow Gang, operated on a level of patience that drove modern lawmen insane. He wasn't speeding down highways with sirens blaring. He was sitting in silence, smoking a pipe, studying the invisible spiderweb of family connections that Clyde relied on. Hamer knew that a man like Barrow could outdrive a police cruiser, but he couldn't outrun his own habits. Hamer stopped looking for the car. Instead, he started dissecting the families. He spent weeks crisscrossing the state lines, applying pressure not on the gang, but on the mothers, the sisters, and the fathers. When his focus landed on the Methvin family, he didn't see a criminal enterprise. He saw a fracture. He saw a father terrified for his son. Hamer was a predator who could smell fear through a brick wall. He knew that Ivan Methvin was the pressure point, the loose brick in the fortress wall. While Clyde was busy counting stolen cash in the back of the Ford, thinking he was the smartest man in the room, Hamer was already 3 steps ahead, orchestrating a tragedy. The twist here is painfully ordinary. It wasn't advanced ballistics or a high-speed pursuit that cracked the case. It was the simple human exploitation of a father's terror. Hamer didn't need to be faster than the V8. He just needed to be smarter than the loyalty holding the passengers together. He moved like a shadow, darkening the door of anyone who knew the Methvins, tightening the screws until something popped. The meeting that sealed Clyde Barrow's fate didn't happen in a police station or a courtroom. It happened in the deep woods, where the laws written by the men standing there. Sheriff Henderson Jordan and Ivan Methvin met in secret, under the canopy of pine trees that muffled their voices. The atmosphere was thick with humidity and treason. Ivan didn't have much to offer in terms of money, but he had something better: the root. "Texas wants him dead," Jordan told him, his voice low. "Louisiana just wants him gone. You give us Clyde, Henry lives." The proposition hung in the air, heavy as the humid night. This was the moment the rusted logging chain found its purpose. Ivan, looking at the ground, kicked at a pine cone. He spoke of blocking the road, of creating a natural pause in the inevitable motion of Clyde's life. He knew the geography of Highway 154 better than anyone. He knew exactly where to stage the accident. The deal was finalized with a handshake that felt more like a transfer of a curse. The promise was explicit: an unconditional pardon for Henry Methvin in Texas. A literal get-out-of-jail-free card, signed in advance, payable upon the delivery of 2 corpses. Ivan wasn't just selling out a guest, he was selling out the code of the outlaw. "I put them in the kill box," Ivan said, according to the legend whispered by those who knew the sheriff. "You give me the boy." It was a transaction of blood for paper, and as they parted ways, the woods seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the check to be cashed. On the days of May 21st and 22nd, 1934, the stage was set. The posse, a collection of Texas Rangers and Louisiana officers, assembled in the brush along Highway 154. It wasn't a tactical formation. It was a firing squad waiting for a target. The conditions were miserable. For nearly 2 days, these men lay in the dirt, covered in poison ivy, tormented by swarms of mosquitoes, unable to smoke or speak above a whisper. The waiting breaks men. It strips away the adrenaline and leaves only the gnawing doubt. Hamer kept them rigid, his presence alone enough to suppress the grumbling. But the real performance was being delivered by Ivan Methvin. He had to continue his routine, acting the part of the hospitable host whenever Clyde dropped by, knowing that every meal he served might be the last. It requires a specific kind of soul death to look a man in the eye, offer him coffee, and know you have arranged for his execution in 48 hours. Ivan was the linchpin. If he cracked, if he showed a flicker of guilt, Clyde's sixth sense would trigger, and the V8 would be gone in a cloud of dust. Ivan played the role of his life. He walked the farm, he fixed fences, and he prepared the truck. He was creating a theater of normalcy around a singularity of violence. The posse waited in the bushes, checking their watches, wiping sweat from their eyes while Ivan checked the road, his heart likely hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The night before the ambush, May 23rd, was the critical turning point. The mechanics of the trap required one specific condition. Henry could not be in the car. If Henry was in the back seat, Henry would die. The Texas Rangers weren't known for their precision shooting when it came to preserving collateral damage. They were known for volume. Ivan had to surgical removal his son from the tumor he was about to excise. It happened at a diner in Shreveport. The details have blurred into legend, but the core move was a masterclass in manipulation. As the group finished eating, a plate of cold eggs sitting between them, Ivan made his move. He staged a reason for separation, a feigned illness, a forgotten errand, or perhaps simply a direct order from father to son that Clyde respected. "You stay here, Henry," he might have said. "Let me talk to them about the safe house." Whatever was said, the result was the separation of the calf from the herd. Henry stayed behind. Clyde and Bonnie, alone now, agreed to meet Ivan back at the farm the next morning. It was a seemingly small logistical change, a shift in passengers that barely registered to Clyde. But to Ivan, it was the difference between a funeral for two and a funeral for three. As Clyde drove away into the night, he didn't realize he had just dropped off his only shield. The sun rose on a humid Louisiana morning. Ivan Methvin drove his old truck down Highway 154 and parked it on the shoulder just past a rise in the road. This was the kill box. The setup was primitive, brilliant, and devastating. He took a jack, lifted the rear axle, and removed the passenger side tire. He wasn't fixing a flat, he was building a prop. This is where the object returns. The rusted logging chain was dragged from the truck bed and draped conspicuously over the axle, trailing into the dirt, suggesting a towing attempt or a breakdown in progress. It was a visual signal of distress, a help me sign designed specifically to appeal to Clyde Barrow's paradoxical nature. For all his violence, Clyde was known to help kin. If he saw Ivan's truck broken down, he would stop. It was a certainty. The genius of the trap was that it forced the Ford V8, a machine capable of outrunning aircraft of the era, to do the one thing it wasn't designed for: crawl. To ask if Ivan needed help, Clyde would have to slow to 5 miles per hour. The mechanical failure of the truck was the mechanical failure of Clyde's survival instinct. Ivan dusted his hands, looked at the empty road, and took his position. The trap was baited not with food but with empathy. The truck sat there, innocuous and heavy, blocking the lane just enough to force a decision. The sound arrived before the car did. The low, guttural hum of a Ford Flathead V8 approaching at speed is a sound you feel in your chest. In the bushes, the lawman stiffened, safety catches clicking off with deafening loudness in their own ears. Frank Hamer raised his rifle. Down the road, the gray sedan crested the hill, moving fast, slicing through the morning mist. This was the apex of the hunt, the moment 2 years of chasing condensed into a single heartbeat. Inside the car, Clyde Barrow saw the truck. He saw Ivan Methvin standing by the wheel. His brain registered friend. He eased off the gas. The car's nose dipped as he applied the brakes. He was doing exactly what Ivan had banked on, being a decent guy to a friend. The car rolled to a near stop, dust swirling around the tires. Clyde rolled down the driver's side window, leaning out, sunglass clad, preparing to shout a greeting or offer a lift. This is the twist of the knife. Ivan didn't say hello. He didn't wave. He looked at Clyde, their eyes meeting for a fraction of a second, a moment of recognition and betrayal that surely lasted an eternity in Clyde's mind. Then Ivan dove. He threw himself under the chassis of the truck, scrambling into the dirt. It wasn't a move of fear. It was the signal. The friendly face vanished, leaving Clyde staring at an empty road and 6 heavy rifles leveled at his head. The noise was not a sequence of shots. It was a continuous, tearing roar. It didn't sound like gunfire. It sounded like the sky ripping open. A Browning automatic rifle, BAR, cycles rounds so fast the individual reports blur into a single chaotic scream. Then imagine 4 of them, plus shotguns and rifles, opening up from 20 yards. The car didn't just take bullets, it was physically rocked on its suspension by the impact of the lead. The glass disintegrated instantly, the metal perforated like paper. Inside, the bodies of Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker were tossed like rag dolls in a hurricane. It was an execution of staggering violence, fueled by years of frustration and fear. The lawmen didn't stop to aim. They emptied their magazines, reloaded, and emptied them again. 167 bullet holes were later counted in the vehicle. The shock was total. It was over in the 16 seconds. The engine died, the radiator hissed, releasing a cloud of steam that mixed with the gun smoke. Then silence rushed back into the clearing. Heavier than before. The legend didn't fire a single shot. The shotgun on Clyde's lap was never raised. The pistol in Bonnie's hand was never cocked. They died before they could even process the betrayal. The violence was absolute, erasing the myth of the shootout in a hail of unidirectional fire. The smoke began to clear, drifting lazily into the pine branches. Frank Hamer stood up from the brush, his face impassive, stepping onto the road to inspect the wreckage. The smell was overpowering: gunpowder, gasoline, and hot blood. He approached the car not with triumph, but with the grim satisfaction of the exterminator. He looked inside, confirmed the identities, and nodded. The job was done. Then came the handover. Ivan Methvin crawled out from under his truck, dusting the red Louisiana dirt off his knees. He didn't look at the car. He looked at the lawman. There was no handshake, no congratulations. The dynamic had shifted instantly. He was no longer the conspirator, he was the pariah. But he was a pariah with a receipt. The pardon was processed. Texas kept its word, technically. Ivan stood there, alive, while the two bodies in the car cooled. He had successfully traded their blood for his son's future. It was the ultimate transactional moment. The logging chain on the truck axle still hung there, a silent testament to the mechanics of the lie. The pardon paper was somewhere in a briefcase, a dry legal document that cost 2 lives to print. Ivan turned his back on the Ford. He had paid the bill. The immediate aftermath was a circus of the macabre. Within hours, crowds descended on the scene like vultures. They didn't just look, they took. People attempted to cut off pieces of Clyde's hair, snippets of Bonnie's blood-soaked dress, and even tried to pry off earlobes as souvenirs. It was a grotesque display of celebrity worship, revealing that the public loved the monster as much as the hero. But the real cost was paid in silence. Henry Methvin got his pardon. He walked free, technically cleansed of his crimes in Texas. But a pardon wipes the record, not the reputation. In the criminal underworld, he was marked forever as a rat. In the lawful world, he was a murderer who got away with it. He lived, but he lived as a ghost, drifting, drinking, haunted by the price his father paid. He survived the electric chair only to die years later in a drunk driving accident, cut in half by a train, some say, as if the violence he escaped had finally circled back to collect the balance. Years turned into decades. The legend of Bonnie and Clyde grew into a Hollywood myth, romanticized and polished. But deep in Louisiana, on the old Methvin property, the truth remained rusted in the weeds. Ivan Methvin lived out his days as an old man who rarely spoke of that May morning. The recurring object returned to the earth. The rusted logging chain, the silent partner in the ambush, eventually was lost in the tall grass, reclaimed by the farm. It lay there, oxidizing slowly, heavy with history. It was a perfect symbol, strong enough to stop the fastest car in America, but in the end, just a piece of cold iron that bound a father to a terrible choice. Real wealth, Ivan might have thought in those final years, is having a sleep without ghosts. He bought his son a life, but he paid with his soul. In the end, it wasn't about the money or the fame. It was about being the only one who knew that the great Bonnie and Clyde didn't die fighting the law. They died stopping to help a friend.